darkness. That's what came before. Not metaphorical darkness, actual darkness. Before 1859, when the sun went down in America, the night belonged to those who could afford it. Whale oil lamps burned in the parlors of the wealthy, casting their warm glow across mahogany furniture and imported carpets. Tallow candles flickered in the windows of the middle class, providing just enough light to finish the evening's work, and the poor simply went to bed, because darkness was free and light was not. In a log cabin in western Pennsylvania, in a small town called Titusville that most Americans had never heard of, an unemployed railroad conductor named Edwin Drake stared at a hole in the ground. For months, the locals had mocked him. They called him crazy. Some called him worse. They said you couldn't pump oil from the earth the way you pump water from a well. Oil seeped up from the ground naturally in some places, and people collected it in small quantities for medicine and lubricant. But drilling for it? That was madness. On August 27, 1859, at a depth of 69 feet, Drake proved them wrong. Black crude bubbled up from the rock, flowing at a rate of about 25 barrels per day. Within months, the news had spread across the nation, and in that moment, a new industry was born. Not just an industry. A transformation of American life that would touch every home, every factory, every street corner in the nation. But this is not a story about oil. Not really. This is a story about what happens when one man looks at chaos and sees opportunity. When one mind decides that an entire industry, an entire nation, an entire way of life needs to be reorganized according to a single, ruthless, obsessive vision. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, and by the time he was done, he would control 90% of all oil refined in America. He would become the richest person in modern history, with a fortune that at its peak equaled nearly 2% of the entire American economy. Adjusted for today's GDP, that's roughly $400 billion. Some estimates go even higher. To put it in perspective, that's more than twice the wealth of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos at their peaks. It's more than some nations produce in a year. Genius or villain, innovator or destroyer, the debate has never ended, and maybe it never should. The oil regions of western Pennsylvania in 1860 were not a place for the faint of heart. When Drake struck oil, word spread like wildfire through the valleys and hills of what had been quiet farming country. Within months, thousands of fortune seekers descended on the area. They came by wagon and on foot, carrying picks and shovels and dreams of wealth. Derricks sprouted like weeds across the landscape. Men drilled wherever they could find a patch of ground, often within feet of each other, racing to extract as much oil as possible before their neighbors could do the same. And the oil flowed, sometimes too much of it. The problem was that nobody knew how much oil was down there. Nobody knew how long the wells would produce, and so everyone operated with the same frantic logic. Get it out of the ground now, before someone else does, before the wells run dry, before the boom becomes a bust. In 1859, the year of Drake's discovery, the average price of a barrel of crude oil was $16. That seems reasonable until you understand what happened next. By 1861, production had exploded from 2,000 barrels to over 2 million barrels annually. Supply vastly exceeded demand. The price collapsed to 49 cents per barrel. At one point, whiskey barrels cost more than the oil inside them. The oil itself was nearly worthless. Speculators who had arrived with dreams of wealth left in ruins. Boom and bust, feast and famine. The oil regions became a case study in what unregulated capitalism could create. Extraordinary opportunity and extraordinary destruction, often in the same week. Men made fortunes in months and lost them in days. Towns sprang up around productive wells and became ghost towns when the wells went dry. It was chaos, pure and simple. And one young man, watching from 100 miles away, saw in that chaos the opportunity of a lifetime. 100 miles west, in Cleveland, Ohio, John D. Rockefeller was 20 years old in 1859. Already working as an assistant bookkeeper for a small produce commission firm called Hewitt & Tuttle. He earned 50 cents a day when he started, a sum he recorded meticulously in his personal ledger, alongside every other penny that came into or went out of his pocket. He was methodical to the point of obsession. He kept records of everything. He analyzed every transaction. He looked for inefficiencies the way other men looked for gold. Rockefeller was not born into wealth. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman who sold dubious patent medicines and was away from home for months at a time. The family moved frequently. There was never quite enough money. His mother, Eliza, was devoutly religious, a Baptist who instilled in her son the values of thrift, hard work, and faith. John absorbed those lessons deeply. He tithed religiously from his very first paycheck. He neither drank nor smoked nor gambled, nor engaged in any of the entertainments that occupied other young men of his age. He was, by all accounts, profoundly boring and profoundly observant. When Drake struck oil in Titusville, Rockefeller was already thinking about the future. He had saved enough money from his bookkeeping job and a small loan from his father to start a commission business with a partner, Maurice Clark. The firm, Clark and Rockefeller, traded in grain, hay, meat, and other commodities. It did well during the Civil War, when the Union Army needed supplies and prices were high. But Rockefeller was looking beyond commodities. He was looking at oil. What he noticed was something that the wildcatters in Pennsylvania seemed to miss entirely. The money in oil wasn't in drilling. Drilling was a gamble. You might sink a well and strike a gusher that produced thousands of barrels, or you might drill for months and find nothing but rock. The men who drilled were taking enormous risks, and most of them would fail. But the men who refined the oil, who took that raw crude and transformed it into something useful, they were dealing in certainties. They knew what came out of their refineries. They could calculate their costs and their profits. They could build a business. Kerosene was the product that mattered. When crude oil is refined, it separates into different components. Kerosene was the most valuable of these, a clean-burning fuel that could power lamps. Before kerosene, artificial light was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Whale oil cost $1.50 per gallon. Sperm whales had been hunted nearly to extinction, their populations devastated by decades of intensive whaling, and still the supply couldn't meet demand. Tallow candles were cheaper, but produced a dim, smoky light that left soot on walls and ceilings. When the sun went down, most Americans simply stopped working. They stopped reading. They stopped living, in a sense, until dawn arrived again. Kerosene changed everything. It burned cleaner than whale oil, produced more light than candles, and could be manufactured in quantities that whale hunters could never match. The limiting factor was no longer hunting ships sailing to distant oceans. It was refineries and raw material. And suddenly, there was raw material in abundance. In 1863, Rockefeller and his partner Clark invested $4,000 in a small Cleveland refinery. The refinery was run by a chemist named Samuel Andrews, who had developed efficient methods for producing high-quality kerosene. It was a modest beginning. Cleveland had dozens of refineries at the time, all competing for crude from Pennsylvania, all struggling to survive the volatile swings in oil prices. Most of them would fail within a decade. Rockefeller's would not, because from the very beginning, he understood something his competitors did not. Efficiency was everything. The refinery business seemed simple on the surface. Buy crude oil, refine it into kerosene and other products, sell those products to distributors and merchants. But every step of that process offered opportunities for waste and therefore opportunities for savings. Rockefeller examined every step with the obsessive attention to detail he had developed as a bookkeeper, and he found waste everywhere. While other refiners dumped gasoline as a worthless byproduct into nearby rivers and creeks, Rockefeller found ways to use it as fuel for his own operations. While others produced mountains of waste, Rockefeller hired chemists to extract every usable substance from every barrel of crude. Paraffin for candles, lubricating oils for machinery, naphtha for solvents, petroleum jelly, which would eventually be marketed as Vaseline. He squeezed value from every drop, turning waste products into profit centers. He built his own barrels. This was not a glamorous innovation, but it was a significant one. Other refiners paid cooperages $2.50 per barrel to make the wooden containers they needed. Rockefeller bought his own tracks of white oak timber, built his own kilns to dry the wood, hired his own coopers, and manufactured his own barrels for less than $1 each. He bought no insurance. Instead of paying premiums to insurance companies, he built his refineries well, maintained them carefully, and hired his own fire crews. When everyone else was paying insurers, he was investing that money in growth. He employed his own plumber and cut the cost of installation labor nearly in half. He negotiated bulk purchases of materials, getting better prices than his competitors who bought in smaller quantities. Every detail mattered. Every cent saved was a cent that could be reinvested in better equipment, more capacity, more efficiency. The margins in refining were thin. Most refiners operated on the edge of profitability, vulnerable to every swing in crude prices. Rockefeller built margins that could survive anything. By 1870, Rockefeller's refinery in Cleveland was the largest in the world. He had bought out his original partners and brought in new ones who shared his vision. His brother William joined the business. Henry Flagler, a grain merchant with a talent for negotiation, became a crucial partner. Samuel Andrews continued to refine the refining process. Together, they were building something unprecedented. On January 10, 1870, John D. Rockefeller incorporated the Standard Oil Company with a capitalization of $1 million. His partners included his brother William, Henry Flagler, Samuel Andrews, Stephen Harkness, and a small group of investors who shared his vision of consolidation and efficiency. The name itself was carefully chosen. Standard, a promise of quality, a guarantee of consistency. In an industry plagued by adulterated products that sometimes exploded in customers' lamps, killing families and burning homes, Rockefeller offered something revolutionary: reliability. The kerosene that came out of Standard Oil refineries met a standard. It burned cleanly. It didn't explode. It lit homes across America, and increasingly, homes around the world. The company's reputation for quality was not an accident. It was a strategy, and it worked. The company's main product was kerosene, and kerosene was transforming American life in ways that are difficult to appreciate today. We take artificial light for granted. We flip a switch, and the darkness disappears. But for most of human history, night meant darkness, and darkness meant the end of productive activity. The wealthy could afford to illuminate their evenings with expensive lamps. Everyone else adapted to the rhythm of the sun. In 1865, the price of kerosene was 58 cents per gallon. Still expensive, but falling. By 1870, it had dropped to 26 cents, and Standard Oil was just getting started. By 1880, the price would fall to 9 cents per gallon. By 1890, to 7 cents. Light, for the first time in human history, became affordable for almost everyone. Working-class families could read after dinner. Students could study after dark. Factories could operate through the night, their workers able to see what they were doing. The very rhythm of human existence began to shift, and Rockefeller, more than any other single person, made it happen. The economic impact is difficult to overstate. Before cheap kerosene, the average American family went to bed when it got dark, because burning fuel was too expensive to do otherwise. After cheap kerosene, that same family had 2 or 3 more hours of productive time every day. They could learn new skills. They could read books and newspapers. They could do piecework or home manufacturing. The increase in literacy, in education, in productivity that followed the kerosene revolution has never been properly measured, but it was enormous. But there's another side to this story, because Rockefeller didn't just want to be the best refiner in America. He didn't just want to offer the best product at the best price. He wanted to be the only one, and the methods he used to achieve that goal cast a very long shadow. The year 1872 marked a turning point in the history of American business, not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened, and because of what Rockefeller did while everyone else was focused on the scandal. In late 1871, a secret organization called the South Improvement Company was formed. The participants included representatives of the 3 major railroads that served the oil regions: the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central, and the Erie Railroad. Also participating were a select group of large refiners, including representatives of Standard Oil. The scheme they devised was elegant in its brutality. Here's how it worked. The railroads would raise their official freight rates dramatically, making it more expensive to ship oil. But they would provide rebates to members of the South Improvement Company, effectively reducing those rates back to their original levels or below. This alone would give the member refiners a significant advantage over their competitors. But the scheme went further. The railroads would also pay drawbacks to the South Improvement Company. A drawback was a share of the freight charges paid by competitors. For every barrel that an independent refiner shipped, Standard Oil and its allies would receive money. The more oil their competitors shipped, the more money the cartel would receive. It was a system designed to make competition literally impossible. Every time a competitor did business, they would be subsidizing their rivals. The plan never went into effect. In February 1872, when the railroads announced their rate increases, word of the scheme leaked out. The reaction in the oil regions was explosive. Independent oil producers in Pennsylvania organized mass protests. They burned members of the South Improvement Company in effigy. They called it a conspiracy against free enterprise, a scheme to destroy honest businessmen for the benefit of a wealthy cabal. The newspapers took up the cause. The Pennsylvania legislature investigated, and within weeks, the South Improvement Company's charter was revoked. The railroads backed down and announced that they would provide no special treatment to anyone. On paper, it was a complete defeat for Rockefeller and his allies. The scheme had failed. Public opinion had turned against them. They were villains in the public imagination, symbols of everything that was wrong with the new industrial order. It looked like a turning point, a moment when the people had risen up and defeated the monopolists. But Rockefeller was already 3 steps ahead. While everyone else was focused on the scandal, he was quietly buying up his competitors. Between mid-February and late March 1872, in what historians would later call the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller systematically acquired 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland. The methods varied. Some were offered fair prices, or what seemed like fair prices given the circumstances, and they accepted. Others were shown Standard Oil's books, invited to see the scale of operations and the efficiency of the methods, and persuaded that resistance was futile. A few were told explicitly that with the South Improvement Company contracts, or contracts like them, Standard could crush them. Even though those specific contracts had been cancelled, the fear remained. The railroads had shown their willingness to favor large shippers. Who was to say they wouldn't do it again? Many sellers later claimed they had no choice. They were offered prices far below what their refineries had cost to build, sometimes as little as 45% of their own valuation. But what was the alternative? Compete against a company that could ship oil at dramatically lower costs? Wait for the next scheme, the next alliance between railroads and the giants? Fight a battle they couldn't win? Most took the money and walked away. Some joined Standard Oil, trading their independence for a share of the larger enterprise. A few held out, but they were increasingly isolated. The testimony of one of these sellers, recorded years later during a congressional investigation, captures the atmosphere of those weeks. He described being told that unless he sold out to the South Improvement Company, he would be crushed out. His partner reported that Rockefeller's men said essentially the same thing. They sold their company at a loss, he explained, because they had no choice. The men from Standard told them they had a contract with the railroad which they could use to crush anyone who resisted. When he saw the terms of that contract, he decided to withdraw from the business rather than fight a monopoly with no chance of winning. His refinery was worth perhaps $150,000. He sold it to Rockefeller for $65,000. Rockefeller saw himself differently. He was not a destroyer, but a savior. He called himself an angel of mercy, absorbing the weak, eliminating waste, bringing order to chaos. The oil industry was sick with overproduction and ruinous competition. Refineries were operating far below capacity. Prices were volatile. Quality was inconsistent. Someone needed to rationalize the industry. Someone needed to impose discipline. If not him, then who? There is a logic to this argument that is difficult to dismiss entirely. The oil industry in 1872 was genuinely chaotic. Too many refineries were chasing too little crude. Prices swung wildly. Companies that were profitable one month were bankrupt the next. Consumers couldn't trust the quality of the products they bought. Some of those products were genuinely dangerous. The consolidation that Rockefeller imposed did bring stability. It did bring quality. It did bring lower prices. Whether those benefits justified the methods used to achieve them is a question that has never been definitively answered. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled 90% of oil refining in the United States. 90%. One company, one organizational vision, one man at the center of it all. It was an achievement without precedent in American business history, and it created a problem that Rockefeller's lawyers would have to solve. How do you control an industry spread across dozens of states when the law says that corporations can only operate in the state where they're chartered? Ohio had granted Standard Oil its corporate charter, but the company owned refineries in Pennsylvania and New York and New Jersey and a dozen other states. Each of those refineries was technically a separate company, chartered in its own state. Managing them all was a logistical nightmare, and the legal structure was vulnerable. Any state attorney general could challenge the arrangement. Something more robust was needed. Rockefeller's lawyers found a way. On January 2, 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was born. 41 investors signed the Standard Oil Trust Agreement, pooling their shares in 40 different companies under the control of 9 trustees. Rockefeller was, of course, the primary trustee. The other trustees included his brother William, Henry Flagler, and the leaders of the various companies that had been absorbed into the Standard Empire. The innovation was legal as much as organizational. By creating a trust, Rockefeller avoided the restrictions that states placed on corporations. The trust was not a corporation. It was an agreement among shareholders to place their shares in the hands of trustees who would manage them for the benefit of all. The individual companies retained their separate identities. They kept their names, their officers, their apparent independence, but they all answered to the same trustees, and those trustees answered to Rockefeller. The trust controlled refineries from New Jersey to California. It owned 4,000 miles of pipelines. It employed over 100,000 workers. It operated storage facilities that could hold millions of barrels of oil, and it was essentially invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. You could see its effects, but you couldn't prove its existence. The various companies kept their separate identities. They competed with each other in appearance, but the profits all flowed to the same place, and the decisions were all made by the same small group of men. The numbers tell the story of what Standard Oil became. By 1904, the company controlled 91% of oil refinement and 85% of final sales in the United States. Most of its output was kerosene, with 55% exported around the world. The trust owned 14,000 miles of pipelines, enabling it to move oil from wells to refineries to markets without depending on railroads. Its tanker cars dominated the railroads anyway. Its storage facilities held more oil than most nations could produce. It had developed over 300 products from petroleum, from lubricants to paint to petroleum jelly to chewing gum. There was essentially no aspect of the oil industry that Standard did not touch. The scale of operations was almost incomprehensible. When the Standard Oil Trust was formed in 1882, it was already the largest business enterprise in American history. By 1904, it dwarfed everything else. Its revenues exceeded the budgets of most American states. Its workforce was larger than the armies of many nations. Its reach extended to every continent. Standard Oil kerosene lit homes in China and India and Africa. Standard Oil lubricants greased the wheels of industry around the world. The company that had started with a single refinery in Cleveland had become a global empire. To give that some human meaning, consider what it meant for an ordinary American family. The kerosene they burned in their lamps came from Standard Oil. The lubricant that kept their sewing machine running came from Standard Oil. The paraffin in their candles, the petroleum jelly in their medicine cabinet, the wax on their floors. All of it traced back to the same source. One company was responsible for the light that let families read, that let workers finish their shifts, that let children do their homework after dark. The infrastructure Standard built, the efficiency it demanded, the quality it maintained, these were not small achievements. But the methods used to achieve this dominance cast a long shadow. Railroads continued to give Standard favorable rates, not through official cartels like the South Improvement Company, but through quiet arrangements negotiated behind closed doors. Volume discounts, dedicated loading facilities, guaranteed shipments. The railroads had good reasons to favor Standard Oil. Rockefeller's company provided steady, predictable business in an industry characterized by volatility. It built its own loading platforms and storage facilities, reducing the railroad's costs. It shipped such enormous volumes that even a small discount per barrel represented significant savings. From the railroad's perspective, the arrangement made sense. But smaller competitors couldn't match these terms because they couldn't match the volume. A small refiner might ship a few hundred barrels a month. Standard shipped thousands of barrels every day. The cost advantage was insurmountable. Some historians argue that the rebates were justified by the genuine efficiencies that Standard provided. Others argue that they were designed to exclude competition regardless of efficiency. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but the effect was clear. Competition was systematically eliminated. Standard spied on its competitors with an intelligence network that would have impressed a government agency. The company paid bookkeepers and shipping clerks and grocery store owners for information about rivals' customers and delivery schedules. Rockefeller assembled thick card catalogs with monthly reports from field agents, showing every barrel of oil sold by independent marketers in their territory. One Cleveland refiner discovered that Standard paid his own bookkeeper $25 a month to provide information on his shipments. The company knew more about its competitors' businesses than those competitors knew about themselves. Standard created fake independent companies to deceive customers who wanted to buy from someone other than the giant. These companies had their own names, their own offices, their own sales forces. They appeared to compete with Standard Oil, but they were wholly owned subsidiaries, and their profits flowed to the same place as every other Standard operation. A customer who thought he was supporting a local independent was actually buying from the monopoly. When genuine independents tried to compete on price, Standard could afford to sell below cost in their territory while maintaining profits elsewhere. This practice, known as predatory pricing, was designed to drive competitors out of business. Once the competition was eliminated, prices could be raised again. The losses incurred during the price war were investments in future monopoly profits. It was a strategy that required deep pockets and patience, both of which Rockefeller had in abundance. The men who ran Standard Oil were not cartoon villains. Many were devout Christians like Rockefeller himself. They believed in efficiency, in progress, in the elimination of waste. They saw themselves as bringing civilization to a chaotic industry, order to anarchy, quality to a market plagued by fraud and danger. And in some ways, they were right. Before Standard Oil, kerosene quality was inconsistent, sometimes dangerous. Adulterated oil, mixed with cheaper and more volatile substances, caused explosions and fires. Standard's products were reliable. They met a standard, as the name promised. The irony is almost too neat. The company named after quality delivered exactly that, even as it destroyed competitors through methods that had nothing to do with quality. The costs of this consolidation fell on people whose names never appeared in newspaper headlines. Independent refiners who sold their businesses at a loss and watched the industry they had helped build pass into the hands of a single company. Drilling operators who found their crude could only be sold to one buyer at whatever price that buyer was willing to pay. Workers in competing refineries who lost their jobs when Standard shut down facilities it deemed inefficient, consolidating operations in its own plants. Towns that had grown around independent oil operations and withered when those operations disappeared. The human cost of efficiency is rarely counted in the corporate ledgers. For 3 decades, Standard Oil operated largely beyond the reach of public scrutiny. The trust agreement was secret. The connections between supposedly independent companies were hidden. Politicians might rail against monopoly in their speeches, but Standard's influence was pervasive. Company executives contributed to political campaigns. They cultivated relationships with lawmakers. They hired the best lawyers to find loopholes in any regulation that threatened their operations. When the state of Ohio ordered the trust dissolved in 1892, ruling that the arrangement exceeded the powers granted in the original corporate charter, Standard simply reorganized. It moved its headquarters to New Jersey, which had more favorable corporate laws, and continued as before under a new legal structure. The form changed. The substance did not. The public knew something was wrong, but they couldn't quite see what it was. They knew that one company seemed to control everything related to oil. They knew that competitors kept disappearing, but the details remained murky, hidden behind corporate veils and confidential agreements. That is, until a 45-year-old woman with a personal grudge and an extraordinary gift for investigation decided to look more closely. Ida Minerva Tarbell was born on November 5, 1857, in a log cabin in Erie County, Pennsylvania, right in the heart of the oil regions. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, built wooden oil storage tanks for the new industry and later became an independent producer and refiner. She grew up watching the oil industry take shape around her. She saw the boom towns spring up and the bust towns empty out. She knew the men who drilled the wells and the men who refined the crude and the men who lost everything when the prices collapsed. And she watched what happened in 1872 when word of the South Improvement Company scheme reached her community. Years later, she would write about it with a vividness that suggested the memory had never faded. There was born in me a hatred of privilege, she recalled. Privilege of any sort. It was all pretty hazy, to be sure, but it was well, at 15, to have one definite plan based on things seen and heard, ready for a future platform of social and economic justice. The impact on her family was devastating. Her father's business was threatened. The community where she had grown up was consumed by hatred, suspicion, and fear. She remembered her father's face, the worry lines that hadn't been there before, the sense that something fundamental had been violated. Something had been done to these people, something that felt fundamentally unfair, and the memory never left her. After graduating from Allegheny College as the only woman in her class of 1880, Tarbell pursued a career in education and then journalism. She wrote for the Shotokan magazine, a publication associated with the adult education movement. Then she moved to Paris, where she supported herself by writing articles for American publications while studying at the Sorbonne. Eventually, she caught the attention of Samuel McClure, founder of McClure's magazine, and joined his staff. At McClure's, Tarbell established her reputation as a meticulous researcher and compelling writer. Her serialized biography of Abraham Lincoln was enormously popular, nearly doubling the magazine's circulation. She followed it with a series on Napoleon, but oil never left her mind. The events of 1872 still burned, and by 1901, the time had come to investigate. Tarbell convinced her editor to let her examine the history of Standard Oil. What she proposed was unprecedented, a comprehensive investigation of how the company had grown from a single Cleveland refinery to control an entire industry. It would require years of research. It would require access to documents that had never been public. It would require speaking to people who had every reason to stay silent, either from fear or from loyalty. It was, in short, a project that no one had ever attempted before. Tarbell spent the next 4 years on the investigation. She examined court records from cases stretching back decades. She read congressional testimony, railroad commission reports, and state legislative inquiries. She tracked down company documents that had been entered into evidence and therefore become public record. She studied newspaper archives from the oil regions, piecing together the timeline of Standard's expansion. And she talked to people, lots of people. Most remarkably, she secured extended interviews with Henry H. Rogers, one of Standard Oil's most powerful executives. Rogers was a complicated figure. He had been an independent oil man himself before joining Rockefeller's empire, and he retained a certain rough charm that set him apart from the more austere trustees. Through the connection of a mutual friend, the writer Mark Twain, Tarbell arranged to meet with Rogers at his New York office. The relationship that developed was unusual. Rogers apparently believed, at least initially, that Tarbell was writing a sympathetic account of Standard Oil's history. He provided her with documents. He explained the company's operations in detail. He introduced her to other executives. He was, for a time, surprisingly forthcoming. Whether he was trying to shape the narrative or whether he simply enjoyed the conversation with an intelligent and attractive woman remains unclear. What is clear is that he underestimated her completely. Tarbell also met with Henry Flagler, Rockefeller's oldest partner, though that interview was less productive. She sat listening to the story of how the Lord had prospered him, she wrote later. I was never happier to leave a room, but I was no happier than Mr. Flagler was to have me go. Flagler refused to provide specifics about the origins of the South Improvement Company or the early consolidation of Cleveland refineries. He spoke of God's blessings and the virtues of efficiency. He did not speak of rebates and drawbacks and predatory pricing. The history of the Standard Oil Company ran in 19 installments in McClure's magazine from November 1902 to October 1904. The series was a sensation. Safe within their Victorian mansions, one contemporary observer noted, well-bred ladies shuddered at the audacity of one of their sex who had the spunk to describe the legendary Rockefeller as cold, ruthless, unethical. Here, for the first time, was a detailed account of how Rockefeller had built his empire. The South Improvement Company scheme, the Cleveland Massacre, the railroad rebates and drawbacks, the predatory pricing, the industrial espionage, the fake independent companies, all of it documented, sourced, and presented in clear, compelling prose. Tarbell's research methods were revolutionary. She pioneered what would later be called investigative journalism. Rather than relying on interviews alone, she assembled documentary evidence. She cross-referenced different sources to verify facts. She presented multiple perspectives on contested events. She distinguished between what could be proven and what was alleged. The result was a work of journalism that read like a legal brief, marshalling evidence toward a damning conclusion without abandoning the standards of fairness and accuracy. Her portrait of Rockefeller himself was devastating. In a 2-part character study that concluded the series, she described him in terms that no business titan had ever endured in public print. She called him a living mummy, money-mad, and a hypocrite. Our national life is on every side distinctly poorer, uglier, meaner, she wrote, for the kind of influence he exercises. The words stung all the more because they came wrapped in meticulous research that was very hard to refute. Rockefeller never publicly responded to Tarbell's accusations. He referred to her privately as that poisonous woman and instructed his advisors to maintain silence. Not a word, he told them. Not a word about that misguided woman. But silence couldn't make the story disappear. The series was published as a book in 1904 and became a bestseller. It was translated into multiple languages. It was read and discussed and debated in homes and offices across the nation. And it helped establish an entirely new form of journalism that would come to be called muckraking. President Theodore Roosevelt gave writers like Tarbell that label in a 1906 speech. He borrowed it from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, referring to a character who was so focused on raking the muck at his feet that he couldn't see the celestial crown being offered above his head. Roosevelt meant it as a criticism, a warning that journalists were becoming too negative, too focused on scandal, too ready to see corruption everywhere. But the muckrakers embraced the term. If raking the muck was what it took to expose the truth about American business and politics, then they would rake with pride. The publication of the History of the Standard Oil Company changed the political landscape. Public opinion, already skeptical of the trusts that dominated American industry, hardened into outright hostility. Politicians who had quietly accepted Standard's influence found themselves under pressure to act. Newspaper editorials demanded that the government enforce the laws that were already on the books. And slowly, reluctantly, the machinery of the state began to move. On November 18, 1906, the United States government filed suit against Standard Oil of New Jersey under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The Sherman Act had been on the books for 16 years, but it had rarely been used against industrial monopolies. Courts had interpreted it narrowly, applying it more often to labor unions than to corporations. The Standard Oil case would change that. The trial began in 1908 before a Missouri federal court. It was an enormous undertaking. More than 400 witnesses testified over the course of months. The government presented evidence of illegal railroad discounts and kickbacks. It documented how Standard had blocked competitors from using oil pipelines. It exposed the company's espionage operations and its use of fake independent companies. It presented evidence of bribery and political influence. And it showed how, from 1895 to 1906, Standard's kerosene prices had increased by 46%, even as the company's costs had declined, generating enormous monopoly profits. Rockefeller himself was called to testify. He was 71 years old, technically still president of Standard Oil, though he had stepped back from active management in 1895. His appearance was eagerly anticipated. Here was the most famous businessman in America, the richest man in the nation, finally forced to answer questions under oath. The performance was memorable, but not in the way the prosecutors had hoped. When questioned about how Standard Oil had achieved its dominant position, Rockefeller repeatedly claimed that he could not remember. Date after date, transaction after transaction, he professed ignorance. "I do not recall. I have no recollection. That was handled by others." It was a masterful display of evasion, frustrating to the questioners but nearly impossible to challenge. How do you prove that a man remembers what he says he has forgotten? Both the trial court and a unanimous federal appeals court found that Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The company had engaged in unreasonable restraints on trade. It had attempted to monopolize the oil industry through methods that went beyond normal competition. The remedy, both courts agreed, was dissolution. Standard Oil would have to be broken up. The company appealed to the Supreme Court. For more than a year, the nation waited for the final verdict. On May 15, 1911, the decision came. Writing for a unanimous court, Chief Justice Edward White ruled that Standard Oil must be dissolved. The trust had illegally monopolized the oil industry through practices that exceeded the bounds of normal competition. It had to be broken up into separate companies that would compete with each other. The decision was a landmark in American law. It established what came to be known as the rule of reason in antitrust cases. Not every monopoly was illegal, the court explained. Only those that engaged in unreasonable restraints on trade. Standard Oil had clearly crossed that line. Its methods, its scale, its systematic elimination of competition, all of these amounted to an unreasonable monopoly that the law would not tolerate. The decision gave Standard Oil 6 months to reorganize itself into 34 separate companies. The largest of these would be Standard Oil of New Jersey, later known as Exxon, and now part of ExxonMobil. Standard Oil of New York, later Mobil, would eventually merge with Exxon. Standard Oil of California would become Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana would become Amoco, later acquired by BP. Continental Oil would become Conoco, now part of ConocoPhillips. Standard Oil of Ohio would become Sohio, also eventually absorbed by BP. The Ohio Oil Company would become Marathon Oil. Walk into any gas station in America today and look at the name on the sign. There is a very good chance you are looking at a descendant of Standard Oil. The breakup didn't destroy Rockefeller's creation, it multiplied it. And here's the strangest part of the story. The breakup made Rockefeller richer than ever. He held shares in the original Standard Oil Trust. After the dissolution, he received proportional shares in each of the 34 new companies. As those companies grew and prospered in the years that followed, his wealth grew with them. When Rockefeller was informed of the Supreme Court's decision, he was playing golf with a friend, a Catholic priest named Father Lennon. He turned to his companion and asked a simple question: "Have you some money?" The priest said he did not. "Then buy Standard Oil," Rockefeller replied. It was, as it turned out, excellent advice. By the end of 1911, the combined value of the baby standards had risen to $600 million. A decade later, that value had soared to nearly $3 billion, representing what contemporary observers called an unprecedented quadrupling of wealth. The companies had paid out almost $1 billion in dividends in just 10 years. Rockefeller's own fortune peaked at around $900 million in 1913, making him not just the richest American, but almost certainly the richest person in modern history. What drove this explosion of value? Two factors primarily. The first was the automobile. When the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil dissolved, electric lights were rapidly replacing kerosene lamps in American homes. The product that had built the empire was becoming obsolete. But another product, one that Standard had long treated as a worthless byproduct of refining, was about to transform the world: gasoline, the internal combustion engine, the car. In 1911, there were about 600,000 automobiles registered in the United States. By 1920, there would be 8 million. By 1930, more than 23 million. Each of those cars needed fuel. Standard Oil's descendants were perfectly positioned to supply it. They had the refineries, the pipelines, the storage facilities, the distribution networks. They had the expertise and the capital. And now, free from the restraints of the trust, they could compete with each other and with new entrants in a rapidly expanding market. The second factor was simpler. The breakup eliminated the legal cloud that had hung over Standard Oil for years. Investors who had been hesitant to buy shares in a company facing antitrust prosecution now faced no such concerns. The new companies were legal, respectable, and clearly very profitable. Money flowed in, driving up share prices and rewarding existing shareholders like Rockefeller himself. The irony is almost too perfect. The company was broken up at the very moment its business model was about to change. If Standard Oil had remained intact, it would have been the dominant player in the gasoline market from the very beginning, with no competitors of significance anywhere in the nation. Instead, the baby standards competed with each other and with new entrants. They innovated. They expanded. They became some of the largest and most profitable corporations on earth. Some economists argue that the breakup made the industry more dynamic, more innovative, more competitive. Others argue that it merely delayed the inevitable consolidation that would eventually produce today's supermajors. What would Standard Oil be worth if it had never been broken up? Various analysts have estimated that it would exceed $1 trillion, making it one of the largest companies in the history of capitalism. Whether that concentration of power would have been good or bad for the American economy is a question without a clear answer. But it's the question that sits at the heart of every antitrust debate that has followed. From AT&T to Microsoft to Google to Amazon, Rockefeller spent the last 4 decades of his life giving away his fortune. He and his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., donated over $500 million to charitable causes during his lifetime. They established the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913, which became a pioneer in public health and medical research. They funded the University of Chicago from its founding, eventually contributing over $35 million. They created Rockefeller University, originally the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which has produced numerous Nobel laureates. They built parks and roads and libraries. They supported the arts and education. They tried, consciously and systematically, to reshape the Rockefeller name from a symbol of greed into a symbol of generosity. The philanthropy was real, and its impact was enormous. The Rockefeller Foundation helped develop vaccines and fight diseases around the world. Its funding supported the development of penicillin and the eradication of hookworm. Its programs train generations of public health workers in countries around the globe. The institutions funded by Rockefeller money have produced groundbreaking research in medicine, science, and the social sciences. The impact is genuinely incalculable. But the philanthropy doesn't erase the questions raised by how the fortune was made. Is it possible to do tremendous good with wealth accumulated through questionable means? Is the end result all that matters? Or do the methods still count? Can the billionaire's gifts ever fully offset the harms caused by the billionaire's rise? These are not just historical questions. They are asked about every major philanthropist in the 21st century, and they were first asked with the intensity they deserve about John D. Rockefeller. He died on May 23, 1937, at his home in Ormond Beach, Florida. He was 97 years old, just shy of the 100 years he had once set as a goal for himself. His fortune, even after decades of giving, remained immense. His family remained influential. His legacy, even after all this time, remains contested. What Rockefeller built was more than a company. It was a template for American business. The emphasis on efficiency, on vertical integration, on eliminating waste and rationalizing operations, these ideas spread far beyond the oil industry. The trust model he pioneered was copied by companies in steel, sugar, tobacco, railroads, and dozens of other industries. The antitrust response his dominance provoked shaped regulation for generations. The investigative journalism that Ida Tarbell invented to expose him became a pillar of American democracy. The debates about concentration and competition that his career inspired continue to this day. Standard Oil's direct descendants, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP, through its acquisitions, remain among the most powerful corporations on Earth. They have shaped geopolitics, influenced climate policy, and generated trillions of dollars in wealth. They are heirs to a legacy that began with one man's refusal to accept that an industry had to be chaotic. And still the questions persist. When is a company too big? When does efficiency become exploitation? When does dominance become monopoly? Who decides, and by what standard? Rockefeller once said that the secret of success was to do the common things uncommonly well. He did exactly that. He looked at an industry full of waste and brought discipline. He looked at a product full of variation and brought consistency. He looked at a market full of competitors and brought consolidation. Whether that consolidation was genius or crime depends on where you stand and where you've stood all along. The price of kerosene dropped by more than 90% during Standard Oil's reign, from 58 cents per gallon in 1865 to about 7 cents per gallon by 1890. Millions of Americans gained access to artificial light for the first time in their lives. Working families could read and learn and grow after the sun went down. Children could study. Adults could work. The very nature of human existence shifted from a life bound by daylight to a life extended into the darkness. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a transformation of everyday life that we now take completely for granted. But the independent refiners who were crushed, the competitors who were spied upon and undercut and bought out at unfavorable terms, the communities that withered when their industries were absorbed, they paid a price too. Their stories are harder to tell because there are so many of them, and because losing rarely makes headlines. The victors write history, as the saying goes. And John D. Rockefeller did not just win, he rewrote the rules of the game while it was being played. Today, when we debate big tech and market concentration, when we ask whether companies like Amazon or Google or Apple or Meta have become too powerful, we are having a conversation that began with Standard Oil. The Sherman Antitrust Act, the legal framework for challenging monopolies, was first successfully applied to Rockefeller's creation. The rule of reason, the principle that courts use to evaluate whether business practices are anti-competitive, was articulated in the Standard Oil case. The very vocabulary we use to discuss these issues emerged from the fight over one company's dominance of one industry more than a century ago. And perhaps that's the most important legacy of all. Not the gasoline stations or the pipelines or the foundations, not the wealth or the philanthropy or the controversy, but the ongoing, never-resolved debate about what happens when one entity becomes too powerful, about whether markets can regulate themselves or need outside intervention, about the tension between efficiency and competition, between order and freedom, between the benefits of scale and the costs of monopoly. Rockefeller believed he was bringing progress. His critics believed he was destroying opportunity. Both were right, and that is why the debate continues. The oil industry he shaped has transformed the planet, for better and for worse. The companies descended from his creation are now being challenged to address climate change and transition to renewable energy. The carbon they have helped put into the atmosphere is warming the planet. The wealth his family accumulated still flows through foundations and institutions and investments that touch nearly every aspect of American life. The questions Ida Tarbell raised have never been fully answered, only repeated in new contexts with new names. Stand at a gas station today and watch the fuel flowing into your tank. Somewhere in that transaction, invisible but present, is the legacy of a young bookkeeper from Cleveland who looked at chaos and decided to impose order. Whether you're grateful for that order or troubled by how it was achieved, probably says something about how you view capitalism itself, about what you value and what you fear, about whether you believe that progress justifies its costs, or whether the costs must always be weighed against the gains. John D. Rockefeller was not a simple man, and his story is not a simple story. He was devout and ruthless. He was generous and greedy. He destroyed competitors and lowered prices. He concentrated power and distributed light. He broke the rules of his era and helped create the rules of ours. He was, in the end, profoundly American, ambitious beyond measure, successful beyond imagination, and controversial beyond resolution. The darkness that came before, the darkness he helped dispel, that darkness was real. And whatever you think of Rockefeller, whatever judgment you render on Standard Oil, the light was real too. So was the shadow it cast. The story continues. It always does. The baby standards merged and grew and split and merged again. ExxonMobil is now one of the largest companies in human history. Chevron spans the globe. BP, through its acquisitions of Amoco and Sohio, carries Rockefeller's DNA into the 21st century. The names have changed, but the scale, the reach, the power, these things would be familiar to anyone who studied the original trust. And somewhere, in archives and libraries and old court records, the documents remain. Ida Tarbell's research, the congressional testimony, the internal memos and secret agreements, and carefully kept ledgers, the evidence of how it was done, the story of what it cost, the questions that never quite get answered. Maybe that's the point. Some questions are meant to be asked again and again. Each generation has to decide for itself where the line falls between success and excess, between efficiency and exploitation, between progress and destruction. The Standard Oil case gave us the tools to have that conversation. It did not give us the answers. Rockefeller wanted to bring order to chaos. He succeeded beyond what anyone thought possible. But order always has a cost. And who pays that cost? Who decides what counts as acceptable and what crosses the line? These are the questions that define an economy and a society. The man is gone. The trust is broken. The descendants carry on. And every time we fill a tank or heat a home or debate the power of corporations, we are still, in some sense, living in John D. Rockefeller's world, still asking his questions, still wrestling with his answers. The lights are on, the tanks are full, the conversation continues. And somewhere, 100 years gone, a young man from Cleveland is still looking at chaos and dreaming of order, still believing that if he just works hard enough, smart enough, ruthlessly enough, he can make it all make sense. He was right. He was wrong. He was both at the same time in ways that we're still trying to understand. That's the story. That's always been the story. And it's nowhere near over. Consider for a moment the mathematics of Rockefeller's life. He was born in 1839 with nothing but his mother's Baptist faith and his father's dubious example. By the age of 31, he was wealthy. By 40, he was one of the richest men in America. By 50, he controlled an industry that touched every home in the nation. By 60, his name was synonymous with both greed and genius. By 70, he was fighting for his business empire against the full force of the federal government. And by 80, he was reinventing himself as a philanthropist, trying to give away a fortune that seemed to grow faster than he could donate it. The numbers are staggering. Standard Oil processed over 90% of American oil at its peak. That meant 90% of the kerosene that lit American homes, 90% of the lubricants that greased American machinery, 90% of the petroleum products that were transforming everyday life. One company, one set of decisions, one vision of how an industry should be organized. The workforce tells its own story. By 1882, when the trust was formed, Standard Oil employed over 100,000 people. These were not just refinery workers and pipeline operators. They were accountants and chemists, lawyers and salesmen, barrel makers and tank builders, railroad car inspectors and steamship crew members. The company had its own fire departments, its own construction crews, its own housing developments in some locations. It was in many ways a world unto itself. The geographic reach was equally remarkable. Standard Oil refined crude from Pennsylvania and Ohio, and later from Texas and California. It shipped products to every state in the Union and to countries on every inhabited continent. Its kerosene lit homes in China, where the company gave away or sold cheaply the lamps that would burn its fuel. Its lubricants greased the wheels of industry from London to Tokyo. The sun never set on Standard Oil's operations, a phrase usually reserved for empires. The competition, or rather the lack of it, was perhaps the most striking feature. In 1870, there were over 200 refineries in the United States. By 1879, most of them had been absorbed into Standard Oil or driven out of business. The survivors were small operators in marginal locations, allowed to exist because eliminating them wasn't worth the effort. They posed no threat. They could not expand. They were tolerated, not feared. What did this concentration mean for consumers? The defenders of Standard Oil pointed to declining prices. Kerosene went from 58 cents per gallon in 1865 to around 7 cents per gallon by 1890. That's a reduction of more than 87%. Consumers benefited. Families who could never have afforded whale oil or even tallow candles could now light their homes. The democratization of artificial light was real and transformative, but critics noted that prices might have fallen even more in a competitive market. They pointed to the railroad rebates and predatory pricing that eliminated efficient competitors along with inefficient ones. They argued that monopoly profits, even in an era of declining prices, represented a transfer of wealth from consumers to shareholders. And they worried about what would happen when Rockefeller's generation passed on. Would the next generation of leaders be as committed to efficiency and quality? Or would they simply extract monopoly rents from a captive market? The debate raged in newspapers and magazines, in legislative chambers and courtrooms. It was, in many ways, the first great national conversation about the proper role of large corporations in American life. The language and concepts developed in that debate still shape our discussions today. Vertical integration, horizontal consolidation, natural monopoly, predatory pricing, barrier to entry, market power. These terms, now staples of business school curricula and antitrust litigation, were coined or popularized in the struggle to understand and regulate Standard Oil. The political implications were equally far-reaching. The Standard Oil case helped establish the principle that economic power could threaten democratic governance. When a single company controlled an essential industry, it wielded power that rivaled or exceeded that of government. It could influence elections through campaign contributions. It could shape legislation through lobbying. It could punish politicians who opposed it and reward those who cooperated. This was not how a democracy was supposed to function. The progressive era that followed the Standard Oil expose was, in many ways, a response to this perceived threat. Trust-busting became a political movement. Theodore Roosevelt made his reputation as a politician willing to take on the moneyed interests. Woodrow Wilson campaigned on a platform of restoring competition. The Federal Trade Commission was created. The Clayton Antitrust Act strengthened the Sherman Act. The very architecture of American economic regulation was shaped by the reaction to Standard Oil's dominance. And yet the irony remains. The baby standards, freed from the constraints of the original trust, became some of the most successful companies in American history. They competed with each other, yes, but they also grew and prospered in ways that the original Standard Oil might not have matched. The gasoline age required different capabilities than the kerosene age. Innovation, exploration, marketing, these became as important as efficiency and consolidation. The breakup, intended as a punishment, may have been a blessing in disguise. Rockefeller himself never acknowledged this possibility. In his final years, he remained convinced that the trust had been a force for good, that its methods had been necessary, that his critics were motivated by envy or misunderstanding or both. He did not apologize. He did not express regret. He simply continued to give away money and play golf and attend church, living out his days in the comfort his fortune had provided. The Rockefeller name today evokes both the heights of American capitalism and its controversies. Rockefeller Center in New York, built by his son, remains one of the most famous landmarks in the world. Rockefeller University continues to produce groundbreaking research. The Rockefeller Foundation still funds initiatives around the globe. But the family also bears the weight of questions about oil industry practices, from environmental destruction to climate change, that are part of the legacy of the industry their ancestor created. What would John D. Rockefeller make of the 21st century? He would recognize the scale of ExxonMobil and Chevron, the global reach of the petroleum industry, the fundamental importance of energy to modern life. But he might be puzzled by the challenges his corporate descendants now face: the transition away from fossil fuels, the pressure to acknowledge climate change, the scrutiny of business practices that would have seemed normal in his era. The world has changed since 1911, and keeping changing still. The technology of oil extraction has changed almost beyond recognition. Rockefeller's wells in Pennsylvania produced perhaps 100 barrels per day if they were productive. Modern offshore platforms can produce hundreds of thousands of barrels. The scale of operations, the capital required, the technical expertise involved, all of these have grown exponentially. And yet the fundamental business model remains recognizable: extract, refine, distribute, sell, control as much of the value chain as possible. Eliminate competitors where you can. Rockefeller would understand. The regulatory environment has changed as well. Antitrust enforcement, dormant for much of the mid-20th century, has experienced revivals and retreats. The breakup of AT&T in 1984 was explicitly modeled on the Standard Oil case. The Microsoft antitrust trial of the late 1990s raised similar questions about market power and innovation. Today's debates about Amazon and Google and Facebook echo the concerns that Ida Tarbell raised more than a century ago. How big is too big? When does a company's power threaten democracy itself? The questions never go away. They simply find new applications. Each generation must decide for itself how to balance the benefits of scale against the costs of concentration. The Standard Oil case provides a template, not an answer. It shows what can happen when power goes unchecked and what can happen when government intervenes. But it doesn't resolve the underlying tension between efficiency and competition, between order and freedom, between the short-term benefits of consolidation and the long-term risks of monopoly. John D. Rockefeller would probably not be surprised by this ongoing debate. He was, after all, a man who understood that business is never finished, that markets are never static, that the game is always changing even when the stakes remain high. He played that game better than anyone of his era. He won by every measure that mattered to him. And he left behind a legacy that we are still trying to understand. The lights are on tonight in homes across America and around the world. Electric lights mostly, powered by an electrical grid that itself owes something to the industrial infrastructure that Standard Oil helped build. But in some places, kerosene still burns. In developing countries, in rural areas, in emergency situations, the fuel that made Rockefeller rich continues to illuminate the darkness. His creation touches us still. And the gasoline that powers our cars, that drives our economy, that connects our cities and suburbs and rural communities, that too traces back to the industry he dominated. The names on the gas stations may be different, the logos may have changed, but the supply chains and distribution networks and corporate structures all descend, in one way or another, from the template he created. We are, whether we acknowledge it or not, still living in John D. Rockefeller's world, still burning the fuel his industry provides, still wrestling with the questions his methods raised, still trying to balance efficiency against competition, scale against freedom, order against chaos. The darkness before was real, the light after was real, the cost was real, the benefit was real. And the question of how to balance them, how to weigh them, how to learn from them, that question remains the most real thing of all. It's the question Ida Tarbell asked, the question the Supreme Court tried to answer, the question every generation must ask again, because circumstances change and power shifts and new giants arise. What price progress? What cost efficiency? What shadow does the light cast? Rockefeller knew the answer he wanted. His competitors knew a different answer. The courts found their own. History has rendered multiple verdicts, none of them final. And somewhere, in the chemical smell of a gas station or the glow of a late-night lamp, the question still hangs in the air, waiting for someone to answer it, knowing that no one ever fully will. Because that's the nature of these questions. They don't have solutions. They have responses. They have moments of equilibrium that shift and change over time. They have victories and defeats that turn out to be neither as permanent nor as complete as they seemed at the time. Standard Oil was defeated in 1911, and its descendants now dominate the global energy industry. Ida Tarbell won her battle, and the problems she identified persist in new forms. The progressive era reformed American capitalism, and we are still debating how much reform is enough. The story goes on, the questions endure, the legacy remains contested. That's what makes it history that matters. Not the facts alone, though the facts are essential. Not the narrative alone, though the narrative is compelling, but the relevance. The way that understanding what happened helps us understand what is happening now and what might happen next. John D. Rockefeller wanted to bring order to chaos. He succeeded. He also created new problems that his successors have spent a century trying to address. That is the way of all great enterprises. They solve the problems of their time and create the problems of the future. They transform the world and are transformed by it. They win and lose simultaneously in ways that become clear only with the passage of time. This was the truth behind America's most powerful company. Not that it was purely good or purely evil. Not that it was simply a success story or simply a cautionary tale, but that it was both at once. That its achievements were real and its failures were real. That its benefits were distributed widely and its costs were borne by specific people in specific places. That it changed everything and left us still arguing about what that change meant. The man is gone, the trust is broken, the debate continues. And maybe that's exactly as it should be.